Give me a second.
Couple deep breaths.
Yeah. I gotta shake it out. Hey everybody, I'm Mike Levy. We're here at the field test, and you know that we like to include an outlier in these, and well, this is exactly that. This is Acto5's P-Train. It's a 135mm travel trail bike, and it's pretty interesting. It's made in very small numbers. They're only gonna do about 20 of these this fall by a guy in Germany named Simon Metzner. Now there's plenty to cover here, but the gist of it is an 853 Reynolds steel front triangle, a CNC'd aluminum swing arm, and the suspension layout, it's a high pivot with an idler. Yeah, this ain't no cookie cutter trail bike. Let's talk suspension first, and you're gonna find that high pivot layout on the back of the P-Train. Now we've seen a whole bunch of that lately, usually on bikes that are meant for a bit of rowdy riding, like enduro bikes or downhill race bikes. The idea here is that as the rear wheel hits the bump, that high pivot lets the rear axle travel backwards, with the thinking that that lets the bike carry more speed over rough ground. It also makes the bike feel very stable when you're landing from large impacts, drops to flat, big jumps, and stuff like that. The shock is compressed by a compact aluminum linkage that's hidden here within the steel front triangle, and my bike has a Cane Creek double barrel shock with a spring dex on it, and that lets me adjust the rate of the coil spring. You could also get it with an EXT Storia if you want something exotic, or a Fox DHX2 or Float X2 shock. One last thing we need to talk about with the suspension design before we move on is this idler pulley up here. Now that makes sure that the drivetrain forces don't hinder the suspension action. Okay, so that's enough with suspension details. Let's move on to the rest of the frame and look at this thing. If you're not falling in love with this thing, there's something wrong with you. That A53 steel front end and CNC'd aluminum rear end definitely gives the bike a very unique look. Nothing like those carbon fiber bikes that have been optimized to within a gram of their life. The front triangle steel tubes could give the bike a unique feel on the trail, and check out the webbing inside the aluminum swing arm. This thing is absolutely gorgeous. Simon has also bolted a sturdy pad on top of the swing arm to help limit noise and protect the swing arm from damage from the chain hitting it. Now it's not nearly as soft as the stuff you see on other bikes, so it's not as quiet, but it looks like it's gonna last forever. Last but not least, let's go to the front of the bike, and that's where you'll find a beautiful head tube badge and a gusset on the top of the top tube with the AC logo in it. Cable routing is external, and it's held on with aluminum clamps and steel bolts. There's also a threaded bottom bracket shell and a bolt-on ISCG adapter. Now, there's also room to fit a water bottle cage in here and some bosses to bolt it to, but I don't have a bottle small enough to fit inside this front triangle. So yeah, technically you can get one in there, but it's gonna be pretty small. Of course, all those steel tubes and even more steel bolts, well, that all adds up to more weight. This frame weighs 4,000 grams without a shock. Compare that to a lot of other trail bikes that are somewhere in the mid 2,000 gram mark with the shock, and if grams are important, well, the P-Train might not be your bike. German Simon, he does not give a schnitzel about grams. Okay, we're gonna talk about geometry next, and I'm 5'10". This is a medium-sized P-Train with a 475mm reach and a 450mm long C-tube that lets you run long travel dropper posts. So the head angle with 160mm Fox 36 with 64.5 degrees. C-tube angle, 76.5 degrees, and the chainstay length across the board is 425mm at static. But remember at sag that's gonna grow a whole bunch because of that high pivot. So now is when I'd usually talk about all the other models, but Simon doesn't do that. Actually, Simon only sells frames. So I've built the P-Train up with a bunch of test parts that I had lying around, including Crank Brothers XCT29 carbon wheels, Fox's new 36 fork, Hayes' new brakes, and a SRAM drivetrain including their Axis rear derailleur. I've also used an E13 cockpit and obviously our Maxxis control tires. All that adds up to 34 pounds and 3 ounces, but you could probably shave a couple more pounds if you went with even lighter stuff. But either way, I don't think you're getting a P-Train below 30. Price? Well, the frame alone without a shock, 3,440 euros. Or if you want it with an EXT Storia, that's 4,000 euros. So that's the P-Train in a nutshell. Let's steam ahead and talk about how it rides. Now, as with all these bikes, we put on the control tires, and that's a DHF on the front, inflated to 21 PSI, and a dissector on the back, inflated to 23 PSI. This bike came with that Cane Creek coil sprung shock with a spring dex, and that lets me adjust the spring rate. I settled on 390 inch-pounds, and that gave me just a hair over 30% sag for my 155 pound weight. Other things include that Fox 36 that we're pretty familiar with, and I also installed the Hayes Dominion brakes. I had to shorten the lines and bleed those, and everything went super smooth. Let's talk climbing first, and I don't think I need to tell you that the P-Train, well, it wasn't made to be an uphill KOM hunter. It weighs 34 pounds, 3 ounces, but I've helped its cause a little bit by putting on some reasonably light Crank Brothers wheels. So how do you get this thing to the top of the mountain? The best approach is to sit and spin. With the coil sprung shock, it is fairly active. Even with that idler pulley up there where that main pivot is, your best approach is just to stay in the seat and pick a high cadence and turn the pedals over quickly. When you get out of the saddle, it's a very active feeling bike. So the suspension isn't cycling through its travel from your pedaling forces. It's reasonably efficient feeling that way. But when you get out of the saddle and move your weight around, when you're really tired, you know, when you're like, you're doing those kinds of things, that's when the bike can feel like a hell of a lot of bike. If you're the kind of rider who really enjoys technical climbing, well, this probably isn't your bike. But if you're the kind of rider who just wants to get to the top of the climb, then the P-Train is gonna do just fine. Plan ahead, look where you're going, and you're just gonna get there when you get there. And does all that mean that the P-Train is the worst climber of my 5 trail bikes? It definitely does, but it's not a whole lot behind the Salsa Blackthorn, which is another big aggressive trail bike. Okay, so you've got the P-Train to the top of the mountain, you've pulled up your knee pads, it's time to go down. Let's talk about suspension first, and holy this is probably the most forgiving 135 millimeter travel bike that I've ever ridden. I'd call it extremely active, extremely controlled, and deep feeling, and it makes the other bikes of the bunch feel pretty unforgiving. So what's the story here? How is Simon getting the back of the P-Train to feel so good? Well, there's 2 reasons. The first one is that high pivot that gives the bike its rearward axle path. It's impressively stable and unfussed by those hard impacts. While the other bikes can feel somewhat overly light almost and a little bit squirrely and twitchy when you come down and land hard, the P-Train, well, it just keeps on trucking. The other reason, it's that Cane Creek coilover shock. It absorbs the tiniest things. You think about hitting a bump and the shock is moving, and that helps you with the traction. And that's another thing that I wanted to talk about. All the other bikes are air sprung, and some of them really put a focus on pedaling performance. This thing, not so much. The rear end, that rear axle moves up and out of the way for the smallest and tiniest impact. So when it's wet and it's loose and traction is on and off, the P-Train feels even more capable. What about the other end of the stroke? Well, it's good news there too. I've definitely used all the travel multiple times, but I never felt hard bottom, and that's a good sign. So if you can't tell, I'm pretty impressed with the back of the P-Train. This is the kind of thing that you could just launch blindly into all sorts of nasty, rough shit. And you can't say that about many trail bikes. Let's talk about the handling next. During filming, I was riding 3 or 4, even 5 of the bikes back to back through the same 200, 300, 400 foot sections. Some of these were pretty rooty and rocky, and it was also wet, and it was an eye-opening experience. The P-Train, well, it definitely has way more in reserve than the other bikes. It stays calmer, it stays more focused, and it lets you be more relaxed. The back of the bike wasn't fishtailing around nearly as much, and it just had way more traction. and that let me attack the trail more. Because I felt like I needed to make fewer corrections when I was at my limit or when the trail was tricky, it let me lean on the front of the bike even more. And in the corners, this thing, let me tell you, it is amazing. The amount of traction and control you have out of the corners is very impressive. Now, I was a little bit concerned when the trail got slower and tighter. I thought the P-Train might feel like a big old locomotive really struggling through that stuff, but it wasn't the case. It definitely takes a little bit more enthusiasm and energy than, say, a bike like the Giant Trance or the Mojo in that tight stuff to carry the same amount of speed, but it'll do it just as well. Simon has done a really good job of making this P-Train feel almost like an enduro bike when it's really rough and fast and scary, but still feeling like a trail bike when it isn't. It's a well-balanced package that has been really impressive. It's a bit of a mixed bag with the P-Train, first and last. It was last on the climb, almost 40 seconds behind the fastest bike, which was the Giant Trance, over about 12 minutes and 30 seconds. The climb was mixed, a bit smooth and a bit tricky, and I think the P-Train lost its time, throughout the whole length of the climb. It's a different story on the way back down, no surprises there. It was the fastest descender by over 10 seconds on a 4-minute 30 section. Second place, Specialized Stumpjumper. As I've already mentioned, you cannot get a complete P-Train. I built this one up with test gear, but let's go over some component highs and lows during my time testing the bike. One of the first highs, those Hayes Dominion brakes. So much feel and control. It's a very SRAM-ish initial grab, which I like. It doesn't have that Shimano thunk that the Servowave gives you, so a little bit more forgiving feel initially, but still plenty of power. I built the P-Train up with an Axis drivetrain, and I did have one incident where I hit a tree really hard with the derailleur. So hard that I didn't even slow down, I just kept on trucking. I broke the derailleur hanger instantly, but the derailleur itself still as straight as it was when I put it on the bike, and I'm impressed. Pretty burly stuff. A couple other things, let's talk about these Crank Brothers wheels. They definitely saw some abuse on this bike on the downs because I was hitting things a little bit harder, and I have fairly low tire pressure and no inserts as well. Perfectly true wheels, not even a scratch on these things. I also want to say, can you guys hear the Hydra hub in the video? That zzz. I love it. A couple other things, the Cane Creek shock, as I've already mentioned, I'm a big fan of that. And the climb switch, it's not a solid feeling lockout, but it is very effective. The last thing I want to mention is the idler pulley on the frame. I didn't have any troubles with it. I'm always wary of these things clogging up with mud, and it's more complication. But to be fair, zero issues with this one. One thing I will say is if you want better pedaling performance or to save a bit more weight, you're gonna want to put on one of those Fox air-sprung shocks. The other thing that I'll mention is that there's barely any room for a water bottle inside the front triangle. Yeah, you could put a cage on in there, but you're gonna have to use the tiniest baby bottle ever to fit in there. Let's talk pros and cons, and first thing, is this thing even a trail bike? It is so capable on the descents that some people are gonna use it as an enduro bike maybe, I don't know, but it is very good. The next pro for me, I am in love with the way this thing looks. There are a ton of swoopy carbon frames out there, and I'm always excited to see something different. And these steel tubes and the aluminum rear end, they make for a bike that's awesome looking and unique, but be ready for people to ask you questions on the trail. Last but not least, the biggest pro, well, it has to be that rear suspension. It's a big part in why the P-Train is so capable. I don't think that I've ever felt 135 millimeters that is deep and as controlled as this is. So good job, Simon. Okay, on to the cons, and the first one is obvious. It's biased towards descending. The geometry and the suspension performance mean that this thing is never going to be the bike for someone who really wants to work hard on the climbs. Actually, that's not true. You might be working hard, you probably just won't be going that fast. Anyways, con, it's not a climber's bike. Next con, it's heavy. 4,000 grams without a shock. Simon obviously doesn't care about weight, and this thing is held together with about a zillion steel bolts. Now compare that to the other trail bike frames, the carbon frames. They're in the low 2,000 grams to mid 2,000 gram mark. Giant says that the Trance X frame weighs 2,100 grams with a shock, 4,000 grams without, so there you go. Where does that put us with the P-Train? Well, it's a special sort of bike that isn't going to be the one for every kind of rider in the same way that most of us would be happy on a Trek or a Specialized or a Giant. Sure, you can pedal it up any mountain and you could pedal it all day if you wanted. You're just not gonna get there very quickly. And hopefully, there's a rowdy descent waiting for you at the top as well. Well, it's not the all-rounder that some of us are looking for. This bike, and especially its rear suspension, is made for fast, rough trails and for riders who like to pretend they're enduro racers. Stay tuned for more video reviews and roundtable discussions from the field test, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss anything.